Today I want to tell you a story from the high country of Wyoming Territory, from the autumn of 1883. It is a story about a 16-year-old girl named Linnea Mercer, and I believe that once you hear it, you will not forget her. So pour yourself a cup of tea, settle into your chair, and let me take you back to a small mining town called Copper Hollow, where the wind was already changing direction, and the geese had already flown south, and a young girl was about to learn that the cold is not the only thing that can kill you in a Wyoming winter. The first thing Linnea Mercer ever carried into the cave was a sack of potatoes. Not blankets, not firewood, potatoes. Because hunger frightened her more than cold. She had learned that lesson the way animals learn which berries kill. Through suffering. 3 weeks of sleeping in frozen sheds and under wagon beds had taught her something her father used to say when she was little. Cold makes you miserable, but hunger makes you stupid. And stupid in a Wyoming winter gets you buried. She dragged the heavy sack across the frozen ground while sleet tapped against the rocks overhead like fingernails on a coffin lid. Her boots slipped twice on the narrow path. The second time, she nearly lost the potatoes over the edge. 60 pounds of survival tumbling down the slope into the brush below. She caught the rope at the last second. Fingers burning, shoulders screaming. She held on. Below her, the valley of Copper Hollow smoked under a darkening sky. Maybe 200 souls lived down there, spread across a collection of timber houses, a crooked steepled church, a supply store, a blacksmith shop, and the remnants of a copper mine that had once kept the whole town breathing. The mine was dying now. Half the men who once worked it had moved on. The ones who stayed farmed thin soil and cut timber and pretended the good years might come back. Winter was coming early. Everyone in the valley knew it. The geese had already gone. The wind had changed direction twice in a single week. And that, dear listener, is exactly why they threw her out before the snow arrived. Not because they hated her, because the arithmetic did not work. 3 weeks earlier, Linnea had been standing in the kitchen of the only house she had ever called home. The house where her father, Elias Mercer, had lived since before she was born. The house where her mother had died of typhoid fever when Linnea was 7 years old. The house her father had filled 3 years ago with a new wife, Delphine Mercer. Most people called her Della. She had come from St. Louis with a trunk full of pressed dresses and a face that did not show much. She was 38 years old. She was beautiful in a careful, frightened way. And on that particular evening in October of 1883, she placed a leather ledger on the kitchen table and waited for Linnea to read what was written inside. Linnea read it. A list in Della's neat handwriting. On the left side, columns of numbers representing food stores, firewood reserves, lamp oil, flour, salt, dried meat. On the right side, the number of mouths to feed through winter and the number of weeks until spring. At the bottom, a simple subtraction. The numbers did not balance, and beside the column of names, one had been crossed out with a single careful line. Linnea Mercer. The kitchen was very quiet. The cast iron stove was burning low. The smell of boiled turnips hung in the air. From the back bedroom came the sound of Elias Mercer coughing. That deep, wet cough that meant the copper dust had finally found a permanent home in his lungs. There is not enough, Della said. Her voice was flat, calm, like a woman reading a price list. You can see the numbers yourself. Linnea looked at her stepmother. Della was standing very straight, one hand pressed against the small swell of her belly. And Linnea understood suddenly and completely that the woman who had married her father was about to have a child. She understood something else too. She understood why her name had been crossed out and not Della's. Not the unborn babies, not her dying father's. You are pregnant, Linnea said. Della did not answer. She did not need to. Pause for a moment with me, dear listener. Pause and think about what that kitchen must have felt like. A 16-year-old girl staring at a piece of paper with her own name crossed off. A stepmother with her hand on her belly. A father dying in the next room. Have you ever had to leave a home you once thought of as your own? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. I want to hear your story. Now let me take you back to that kitchen. Linnea walked past her stepmother. She walked down the hall to the back bedroom. Her father was propped up against the pillows. He had lost so much weight that the bones of his shoulders showed through his nightshirt. His eyes were the color of weak tea now, but they had been blue once, the color of a clear morning on the high country. Father, Linnea said. Elias Mercer looked at his daughter. He had carried her on his shoulders when she was a little girl. He had taught her the names of every plant worth eating in these mountains. He had buried her mother 9 years ago and never quite recovered. And now he was about to bury himself. He could not speak above a whisper. The cough had taken his voice weeks ago. "Linnea," he whispered, "remember what I taught you about the woods. Remember the deep places. Remember the warm rocks." And Linnea understood in that moment that her father was saying goodbye. He was telling her how to survive. He was using the last of his breath to give her the only inheritance he had left: knowledge. She kissed his forehead. It was hot. She held his hand. The skin was paper thin. She did not cry because crying was a luxury she could not afford. Not yet. She walked back to the kitchen. She packed what she could carry into 2 canvas sacks: a change of clothes, a wool shawl her father had given her when she turned 15, a folding knife, a handful of coins saved from mending work, and a small leather pouch containing a lock of her mother's hair, cut before they closed her coffin. She walked out before sunset without saying goodbye to her stepmother. The porch steps creaked under her boots the same way they always did. The gate swung shut behind her with its familiar iron squeal. She walked down the dirt road toward the edge of town, and she did not look back, because looking back would have meant admitting she still hoped someone would follow. Nobody followed. The road stretched ahead, empty and darkening, and Linnea Mercer walked into it with everything she owned in 2 canvas bags, and a feeling in her chest like a door being nailed shut from the inside. By dawn, the first snow had begun to fall. The first 3 nights nearly killed her. The first night she slept in an abandoned equipment shed near the old mine shaft. The walls had gaps between the planks. The wind whistled through them all night long. Linnea lay on a pile of old burlap sacking with her coat pulled over her head, listening to mice scratch in the corners and her own teeth chatter. Somewhere outside, a coyote called, then another, then a third. She gripped her folding knife and did not sleep. The second night she slept under a wagon behind the feedlot. Rats scurried across her legs at midnight. The ground was so cold it seemed to pull the warmth directly out of her bones. The third night she found a root cellar somebody had forgotten to lock. It was damp and black and smelled of rotten turnips. She slept sitting up against the wall because the floor was too wet to lie down. Each morning the cold bit harder. Each morning she woke more exhausted than the night before. Her joints stiff, her thinking slower, her will a little more afraid. On the third morning she caught herself standing in the middle of the road, staring at nothing, her mind completely blank, and she understood in that moment that she was beginning to shut down. Not her body, her mind. The cold was reaching into the place where decisions lived, and it was dimming the lights one by one. She tried asking for help. She knocked on Wendell Hoke's door on the second evening. Wendell was a quiet man, a widower in his 30s, raising his 8-year-old son Ansel alone. He had gentle eyes and calloused hands and a house that smelled of wood smoke and boiled beans. He looked genuinely sorry when he told her he did not have room. Linnea could see past him into the small kitchen where Ansel sat at the table, doing sums on a piece of slate. And she knew Wendell was telling the truth. The house had 2 rooms. There was barely space for the 2 of them, but Wendell pressed a piece of cornbread into her hand before she left, still warm from the stove, and the warmth of it against her palm almost made her cry. She tried the church next, but the door was locked. The Reverend Whitcomb had gone to Cheyenne to purchase winter supplies. His wife Maricela opened the parsonage door and let Linnea sleep one night on the bench beside the stove. Maricela was a careful woman, 49 years old, steel gray hair pinned back tight, a voice that carried the quiet authority of a woman accustomed to being the moral compass in a town full of pragmatists. In the morning, Maricela brought her coffee and spoke plainly. "If I let you stay longer, others will ask why I did not offer the same to them. Every family in hardship will line up at this door. I cannot shelter everyone, Linnea, so I cannot shelter just one." Linnea understood. It was the same logic Della had used, dressed in kinder clothes. She thanked Maricela for the coffee and left. On the 4th morning, while searching the hills above town for fallen branches to burn, she found the cave. It was not obvious. A narrow crack hidden behind leaning stone and dead brush, halfway up a slope overlooking the valley. Most people would have walked past without a second glance, But Linnea noticed something that stopped her mid-stride. The air near the crack was different. Not warm, not truly, just less cold. A faint breath of something other than the frozen world, exhaling from between the rocks. And she thought of her father. Elias Mercer had spent 12 years going underground every morning, descending into the copper mine with a lantern and a pickaxe, and the quiet faith that the earth would let him back out again. He had told her once when she was 9 years old, sitting on his knee, that the deep places of the world have their own weather, their own rules. Underground stays the same, he said. Summer or winter, the rock does not care. It just holds whatever temperature it wants and ignores everything above. She had not understood then. Now, standing before a crack in the hillside with frost in her hair and no home behind her, she understood perfectly. She crawled inside with a lantern she had made from an old jar and cooking grease. The passage was tight for about 10 feet, close enough to scrape her shoulders on both sides, and then it opened. The stone chamber beyond the entrance was deep and surprisingly dry, with a ceiling that arched overhead high enough to stand beneath. Along the curved rock above, faint black smudges of ancient soot marked the places where fires had burned long ago. Near one wall, flat stones formed an old fire pit, deliberate, shaped by human hands. A narrow crack in the ceiling directly above the pit created a natural chimney. Someone had used this place before. Someone who understood winter the way Linnea was beginning to understand it. She sat on the cold stone floor for nearly an hour, listening to the silence. No wind, no drifting snow finding its way inside, no exposed corners where heat could escape. Just still dry air and the faint mineral smell of deep rock. And in that silence, she realized something that changed everything. She could survive here, but the realization was not comforting. It was dangerous. Because surviving in a cave above a town that had thrown you out meant accepting a life outside the boundaries of the world you knew. It meant becoming something other than a 16-year-old girl waiting for someone to take her in. It meant taking responsibility for her own existence in a way that no one in Copper Hollow had offered to share. She noticed one more thing before she crawled back out into the cold. On the far wall, deep inside the chamber, where the lantern light barely reached someone, had carved marks into the stone with a blade. Hundreds of small vertical lines, grouped in sets of 7. Beside them, scratched faintly, but still legible, a date. November 1862. 21 years ago. Whoever had lived here had counted weeks. Many, many weeks. Linnea stared at those marks and felt two things at once. Hope, because the cave had clearly sustained life before, and a low, cold unease, because whoever had made those marks had eventually stopped counting, and she did not know why. The next morning she returned, carrying the sack of potatoes. She returned the morning after that with canned peaches bought from a farmer's wife on the outskirts of town. And the morning after that with blankets scavenged from an abandoned trapper's shack near the river, stiff with dust, but still thick enough to hold warmth. Each trip exhausted her. The cave sat nearly a mile from town, uphill through rough terrain that would only get worse as snow accumulated. By the third day, her shoulders were bruised purple from hauling bundles of firewood tied with rope. Her hands cracked and bled. A blister formed on her right heel and burst and reformed and burst again until the skin hardened into something that was no longer quite skin, but closer to leather. But each time she entered the cave and set down her load and looked at the growing collection of supplies against the stone walls, something hard and certain settled deeper inside her chest. People noticed quickly. Small towns always notice. Rourke Donnelly spotted her first. Rourke was the town blacksmith, 29 years old, broad-shouldered and absolutely certain about everything. He had the kind of voice that carried across open spaces, whether he intended it to or not, and he used it the way some men use fists, to fill silence before anyone else could. "What are you doing out there?" he called from the road, watching her drag a makeshift sled. "Preparing," Linnea said, for what he asked. Linnea glanced at the gray sky. For winter. Rourke looked at the overloaded sled, then back at her. "You planning to live in the woods, if I have to?" He stared after her for a while before shaking his head. "Girl's gone half wild already," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. But Linnea did not slow her step. She had stopped caring what Rourke Donnelly thought of her around the same time she realized no one in this town had offered her a roof. Every day she hauled more. Flour, salted meat, lantern oil, matches sealed in wax cloth against moisture, buckets for melting snow into drinking water. She organized everything carefully inside the cave with a precision that surprised even herself. Food along the colder rear wall where the temperature stayed lowest. Firewood stacked near the entrance where airflow kept it dry. Blankets raised above the stone floor on a platform of branches to prevent the cold ground from stealing heat while she slept. She even built shelves from fallen timber and scavenged planks, notching the joints with her folding knife until they held steady. The cave was transforming, not into something comfortable, into something functional, a machine for staying alive. Mayor Thaddeus Crail noticed the change in Linnea's purchasing habits before anyone else, because Thaddeus Crail noticed everything that involved money. He owned the only general store in Copper Hollow. He sat on the three-person town council, which in practice meant Thaddeus and two men who agreed with whatever he said. He was 52 years old, lean-faced, with pale eyes that calculated the value of everything they looked at, including people. He wore pressed shirts even in autumn, as if respectability was a garment he could not afford to wrinkle. He caught Linnea outside the store on the morning she came to buy flour. "You have been buying more than normal," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Other families need supplies too," Linnea replied. "I am paying full price." Thaddeus lowered his voice. "I have the right to refuse sale if I determine someone is hoarding in a way that harms the community." She looked at him steadily. She understood what this was. Thaddeus Crail did not care about community welfare. Thaddeus Crail cared about control. His store was the only source of provisions within 30 miles. Every family in the valley depended on him. If Linnea proved she could survive independently, she existed outside his system. And people outside the system made Thaddeus nervous. She bought the flour that day, but she understood the supply line could close at any moment. When she stepped outside, the door opened behind her, and a different voice called her name. Linnea. It was Verity Crail, Thaddeus's daughter, 18 years old, and the closest thing Linnea had ever had to a best friend. Before everything fell apart. Verity had her father's sharp features, but not his sharpness. Her face was open, where his was guarded, expressive, where his was controlled. She pulled Linnea around the corner of the building and pressed a bundle wrapped in cloth into her hands. "Salted pork," Verity whispered. "Take it. My father will not notice. He does not count the pork the way he counts the flour." Linnea looked at her old friend, the girl she used to climb apple trees with, when they were both 10 years old and the world was still simple. Verity hesitated, then added, "He does not hate you, Linnea. He is afraid. If you survive on your own, people might realize they do not need him as much as he wants them to believe." It was a sharp observation. Verity Crail was not a foolish girl. She was trapped. A girl caught between loyalty to her father and a conscience she could not quite silence. Linnea took the pork and said nothing more. But she held Verity's hand for a moment before letting go. And Verity squeezed back. And in that grip was everything neither of them could say aloud in a town where Thaddeus Crail had ears in every wall. A few minutes later, a different voice came from across the street. "Linnea. Child." It was Granny Maeve Tolliver. Granny Maeve was the oldest woman in Copper Hollow, 70 years old, thin as a fence rail, with a back as straight as a rifle barrel, and eyes that had seen more winters than most people alive. She had been the town's midwife for 50 years. She had brought half of Copper Hollow into the world. She had also closed the eyes of many of them when they left it. She approached Linnea quietly. "You found shelter?" she asked. Linnea hesitated, then nodded once. Granny Maeve studied her carefully. The way a woman studies weather signs she has learned to read over decades. "Underground," she said. It was not a question. Linnea's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "Because underground is smarter than freezing," Granny Maeve said. She handed Linnea 2 extra jars of peach preserves without another word or explanation. And then before turning away, she said something that Linnea would remember through every frozen night that followed. "Winter of 1823, Granny Maeve said. I was 10 years old. My family got trapped for 3 weeks in a blizzard outside of Hannibal. My father died on the 12th day from the cold. My mother kept the rest of us alive by digging a shelter under the snow and burning the furniture inside the house. Chairs first, then the table, then the window frames. Granny Maeve looked at her with eyes that had seen 60 years of weather. I am not afraid of winter, child. I am afraid of people who refuse to prepare for it. Then she walked away. Thaddeus Crail made it official 2 weeks before the first real snowfall. He refused to sell to Linnea. Council decision, he told her when she approached the counter. The store was empty except for the two of them and the smell of lamp oil and dried corn. Resources are limited. Priority goes to established families. But it was what happened next that broke something inside Linnea. The bell over the door rang, and Della Mercer walked into the store. Linnea had not seen her stepmother since the day she left. Della was wearing a dark wool dress now. The swell of her belly was unmistakable. She walked past Linnea as if she did not exist. And then she stopped at the counter and turned around and spoke loud enough for the few customers in the store to hear. "She is not my daughter," Della said. The words hung in the air like smoke from a damp fire. "She has been telling people I threw her out. The truth is she ran away. She is unstable, like her mother was at the end." Linnea's mouth opened. No sound came out. "She is hoarding supplies because she plans to leave Copper Hollow before spring. Do not waste your goods on her. She will be gone in 2 months, one way or another." It was a complete lie, every word of it, and it was spoken with such steady calm that Linnea could feel the other customers beginning to believe it. She could see the way they looked at her, the doubt that had not been there a moment before. Della turned and walked out of the store without buying anything. And Linnea understood in that moment that her stepmother had not come to buy flour. She had come to make sure that even if Linnea survived, no one in this town would help her do it. She walked out of the store with her face burning, her hands shaking. Verity was waiting for her at the corner of the building. She had heard everything. "She did not just throw you out," Verity whispered. "She is making sure you cannot come back." Linnea did not answer. She walked back up the hill to her cave, and she sat in the dark for a long time. And she thought about the woman who had crossed her name off a piece of paper and was now methodically erasing her from the town her father had built his entire life inside. It is one thing, dear listener, to be sent away. It is another to be sent away by someone who is determined to make sure you can never find your way home. I want to pause here for a moment. I know this part of the story is hard. I know some of you have known a woman like Della Mercer in your own life. Maybe a stepmother, maybe a mother-in-law, maybe a sister who decided for reasons of her own that you were the one who had to disappear. If you are listening from your kitchen or from your sewing room or from a porch somewhere in Texas or Maine or Oregon, I want you to know I see you. I want you to know that Linnea sees you too. And before we continue, if this story is reaching something inside you, would you do me a small kindness? Hit the subscribe button. It costs you nothing. And it helps me bring more stories like this one to women who need them. Now let us go back, because the wind was changing, and Linnea Mercer was about to find out that she was not as alone as she thought. 2 mornings later, she woke before dawn to find boot prints in the frost outside the cave entrance. Large boots, long stride. Her stomach dropped. She grabbed her knife and her lantern and pressed herself against the wall near the narrow passage. She listened. Nothing but wind. She crawled outside into the gray light. No one was there. But hanging from a low branch near the cave mouth was a freshly caught rabbit, still warm. Beside it, a coil of good rope. No note, no sign of who had left it. The gifts appeared 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. A piece of tan deer hide, supple and clean, a box of matches sealed in wax cloth, a small hatchet with a short handle, the kind a trapper would carry. Each time the same boot prints in the frost. Each time nothing else. Linnea asked Granny Maeve about the marks on the cave wall, the hundreds of tallies grouped by 7s, the date carved beside them. Granny Maeve was quiet for a long time before answering. "Could be Silas Wren," she said. "He was a fur trapper. Lived alone in the mountains for years before he came down to the valley. People say he is odd. Keeps to himself in a cabin on the far side of the ridge." She paused. "But he knows winter better than anyone still breathing around here." "Is he dangerous?" Linnea asked. Granny Maeve smiled slightly. "He is lonely," she said. "That is a different kind of dangerous." Linnea decided to find out for herself. She rose before dawn and waited outside the cave entrance in the dark, knife in her coat, breath smoking in the cold air. She waited 2 hours before she heard the crunch of boots on frozen ground. He came up through the trees slowly, carrying something. He stopped 30 yards from the cave. He did not approach the entrance. Instead, he sat down on a flat rock near the frozen creek bed and placed a bundle on the ground beside him. Then he waited, as if he expected her to come to him. Linnea approached with her hand on the knife. He was older than she expected, 61 perhaps, thin and weathered, with a gray beard that had not been trimmed in months, a coat of worn deerskin patched at the elbows. He did not turn around when she drew close. "You use the rope to snare rabbits," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like a hinge that had not been oiled in a long time. "Good. Why are you helping me?" she asked. Now he turned. His eyes were calm but deeply sad, the way certain old dogs look when they have been alone too long. "Because 21 years ago, I was the first person to live in that cave," he said. "The tally marks on the wall are mine. Every mark is 1 week. I spent 2 winters in there." He nodded toward the hillside. 1862 and 1863. "Why did you leave?" she asked. Silas Wren looked at her for a long moment. "Because when you live alone long enough, you start talking to the stone, and the stone starts answering." He paused. "I do not want that to happen to you." He taught her one thing before he left that morning. He showed her how to arrange firewood in a fan shape around the fire pit, so that the surrounding stone absorbed heat evenly and released it through the night with minimal fuel. "The stone holds warmth," he said, "the way a cast iron pan holds heat after you pull it from the stove. Slowly, steadily, for hours after the fire dies. Small fires work better than large ones. Less smoke, less fuel. Smoke is the enemy. Smoke tells people where you are, and smoke steals the air you breathe." It was the only time anyone would explain the mechanics of cave heating to her. After that, it would simply be something Linnea knew, demonstrated through her actions rather than repeated through words. But before he left, Silas told her one more thing. He sat on the flat rock with his hands on his knees, and he looked at the ground as if he was reading something written there. And his voice when he spoke was lower than it had been before. Older, slower. "That winter of 62, he said, a family was caught in a storm in the valley below. 3 of them, mother and father and a little girl. She was maybe 7 years old." He stopped. Linnea waited. "I heard them," he said. "The wind was bad, but I heard them calling. From down the slope, the little girl had the loudest voice. She was calling for someone. I do not know who, just a name. Over and over. I did not open my door." He looked up at Linnea, and she saw a thing in his eyes that she had only ever seen once before. In her father's eyes. 2 days before he died, when he had whispered that he was sorry he could not stay longer. It was the look of a man who had spent 2 decades carrying a question he could not put down. "When spring came," he said, "I went down to the valley. They found the bodies a quarter mile below my cabin. The mother and father had wrapped themselves around the child to keep her warm. They had frozen that way." He swallowed. "But the little girl had crawled out from between them. They found her another 200 yards up the slope. She had been trying to climb, trying to get higher, toward the smell of wood smoke maybe, toward my cabin. She did not make it." He stood up slowly. He brushed the frost off the back of his coat. "I have lived alone for 21 years, Linnea Mercer. I have not opened my door for 21 years. And every winter I have heard that little girl's voice in the wind. Do not become me." Then he walked away into the trees and did not come back for many days. Linnea stood outside the cave for a long time, looking down at the valley, at the chimneys of Copper Hollow, at the place where somewhere down there her dying father was lying in a bed and a pregnant stepmother was counting coins. And she understood that she had been given a gift. Not the rabbit, not the rope, not the deer hide. A warning. She thought about it for many nights after that. October turned into November. The first snows fell and melted and fell again. The geese were long gone. The wind began coming from the northwest now, steady and dry, and the smell of it was different, sharper, like metal left out in the cold. Word came down from Verity on a Thursday morning, 3 days into November. Linnea was sorting dried beans when she heard footsteps on the path. She knew who it was before Verity reached the cave entrance. She could tell from the slowness of the steps, from the weight of them. Verity crawled through the passage with her face already wet. "Linnea," she said. She did not need to say more. Linnea set down the beans, slowly, carefully, counting each one back into the jar as if the counting itself was a kind of prayer. When she asked, "Last night." Granny Maeve was with him at the end. He was not afraid. He kept asking for you. Linnea closed her eyes. She thought of the last time she had seen him, propped against the pillows, whispering about the deep places of the world, the warm rocks. She thought of his hand on her shoulder when she was 9 years old, teaching her the names of plants. She thought of his voice humming tunelessly the way he always did when he was teaching her something important. She did not cry that day, but that night after Verity had gone, Linnea sat alone by the fire and pulled the leather pouch from her coat pocket, the one with the lock of her mother's hair. She held it in her palm, and she said very quietly into the cave that had become her only witness, the only thing she had left to say. "Father, I am keeping the door open." The fire popped. A log settled. The cave did not answer. But somewhere in the silence, she felt something. Not a presence, exactly. More like a warmth that had not been there before. She sat there for a long time, holding the pouch, until the fire burned down to coals. 3 days later, Verity came back up the hill, carrying a small wooden box. Inside it was a pipe Elias had carved years ago, a leather wallet with a single coin inside, and a folded square of paper. "Della found these in his coat," Verity said. "She told me to throw them away. I brought them to you." Linnea opened the paper. It was a deed, a property deed, in her father's name, for the house on the edge of Copper Hollow, and in the lower corner in fresh ink a signature transferring ownership, Delphine Mercer. Verity watched her read it. "She signed it the day after he died," Verity said. "She sold the house to my father." Linnea looked up. For how much? $200. The house was worth $800 at least. They both knew it. But that was not the worst part. The worst part, Verity said, was that I overheard them. "Last week, my father and Della, they were in his office. They were talking about supplies, about flour prices, about what they could charge for grain after a hard winter." She looked down at her hands. "Linnea, I think they have been planning this since summer." "What do you mean?" "I mean, my father has been hoarding supplies for months. Not just for himself, for control. He told Della he could double his prices by February if the winter was bad enough. She told him she would help him push out the families that owed him money. Yours was the first one she pushed." The cave was very quiet. Linnea felt the heat drain out of her face. She felt her hands go cold even though they were near the fire. "She did not throw me out because of the food," Linnea said. "She did not even throw me out because of the baby." Verity nodded slowly. "She threw you out," Verity said, "because I think my father told her he would buy your house cheap if Elias died with no heirs in the home." The wind moved against the cave entrance. Linnea looked down at the deed in her hand, the fresh ink, the careful signature, and she fully understood for the first time that her stepmother had not been desperate. Her stepmother had been part of a plan, and the man at the center of that plan was sitting in a fortified store in the valley below, with 200 pounds of flour locked behind a heavy door, waiting for winter to make him rich. Linnea did not cry. There was a moment watching the fire when she thought she might, but the tears did not come. She just sat there holding the deed, and she felt something inside her that she had not felt before. Not anger, not exactly. Clarity. 2 days later, Granny Maeve came up the hill. She was carrying a small cloth-wrapped bundle, and she was breathing hard from the climb. Linnea met her halfway down the path and helped her the rest of the way. The old woman did not waste time on hellos. "There is a storm coming," she said. "How big?" Granny Maeve looked at the sky. The clouds had begun to stack to the north, layered and dark in a way Linnea had never seen before, like something solid being slowly built. "Big enough that people should have started preparing weeks ago," Granny Maeve said. "I saw a storm like this once before. The clouds, the way the wind smells, the way the birds stopped coming down to the feeders 3 days ago." 1845. We lost 40 people in that one, across the territory. Not all in one town, but scattered like seeds, old people, children, families who did not have enough wood. Linnea looked at the sky, then at the small bent woman beside her. How long do we have? 2 days, maybe 3. That afternoon, Linnea walked down into town. She walked into the diner during the morning hour when most of the men gathered. She was still wearing her coat, dusted with frost from the walk down, and she stopped just inside the door and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. A bad storm is coming, not an ordinary one. You should increase your wood supply and food stores now, today, before the roads get worse. The diner went quiet. Thaddeus Crail was sitting near the window with a cup of coffee. He looked up at her and smiled the way a man smiles at a kitten that has wandered into a barn. The girl who lives in a cave is telling us how to prepare for winter. A few men chuckled. Rourke Donnelly was sitting near the wall, his hands wrapped around a mug. He grinned. Broad and easy. If the storm is as bad as all that he said. We have got timber homes and cast iron stoves. What have you got? A hole in a hill. More laughter. Wendell Hoke stared into his coffee and said nothing. His son Ansel was sitting beside him, his small face turned up toward Linnea with a curious expression. Wendell put his hand on the boy's shoulder. He did not look up. Maricela Whitcomb had come in to buy bread. She turned to Linnea now with the careful patience of a woman speaking to a child. Linnea, dear, the men here have lived through more winters than you have been alive. Linnea looked around the room one more time. She looked at every face. She wanted to remember them, not out of spite, but because she knew that in a few days some of these faces might look very different. And she wanted to remember what certainty looked like. Before the world proved it wrong, then she left. Nobody followed her. Nobody asked what she had seen or what Granny Maeve had told her. She walked back up the hill through the first flurries of what would become the worst storm Copper Hollow had ever known. That night alone in the cave, she sat beside the fire and listened to the wind begin to change. Not yet a storm, just a warning. The sound a river makes before the flood arrives. The low vibration you feel in your teeth before you hear it with your ears. She had told them. They had not listened. And now the question that would define the next 8 days of her life began forming in the darkness of that stone chamber, quiet as the cold itself. When the storm came and people started dying, would she open this door? Or would she become exactly the kind of person who had thrown her out? The blizzard arrived on a Tuesday night, 3 days after Granny Maeve's warning, and it did not arrive gently. Linnea was sitting beside her fire when she heard it coming, not the wind itself. Something before the wind, a pressure change that made her ears ache and her lantern flame bend sideways without any draft she could feel. Then the sound hit, a roar so deep and sustained that it seemed to come from inside the mountain rather than from the sky above it. The flame steadied, the cave walls did not tremble, and outside the world she had known broke apart. Snow did not fall that night. It attacked. It drove sideways in sheets so thick and so fast that within the first hour, the entrance to the cave became a white wall of moving ice. Wind struck the valley below with a violence Linnea could hear even from inside the stone chamber. A sustained hammering against timber and glass, and anything foolish enough to stand upright. She sat wrapped in blankets, feeding her fire carefully, and listened to the storm spend its rage against the hillside, while the cave absorbed the noise the way deep water absorbs a thrown stone, completely, without effort, and that was what frightened her, not the storm, the cave's indifference to it. Because the calm inside meant the destruction outside was far worse than she had allowed herself to imagine. If the cave barely noticed this storm, then the storm was something beyond ordinary winter. And down in the valley, 200 people had prepared for ordinary. She did not sleep. She sat with her back against the stone wall and stared at the entrance, and thought about the questions she had been asking herself for weeks. Whether to open this door, whether the people who had laughed at her, refused her, crossed her name off a piece of paper, deserved the things she had built with her own bleeding hands. She thought about her father, what Elias Mercer would have done. The answer came immediately, and without doubt. He would have already been halfway down the hill with a lantern and a rope and his coat open. Because he had given his scarf to someone who needed it more. That was the kind of man he was, The kind of man who went deeper into a collapsing mind because he heard someone calling. The kind of man who came home with copper dust in his lungs because he could not walk away from another person's trouble. Linnea was not sure she was that kind of person. She was not sure she wanted to be. Being that kind of person had killed her father. Near dawn, a shape appeared at the cave entrance, snow-covered, moving slowly, too tall for a woman. Linnea grabbed her knife and her lantern and pressed herself against the wall near the narrow passage. The shape crawled through on hands and knees, shedding snow in clumps, and stood up in the firelight. Silas Wren, ice in his beard, his deerskin coat dark with melt. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite calm and not quite afraid. Something between the two. The face of a man who has seen what is coming and understands it will not be stopped. Came through town on the way up, he said, shaking snow from his sleeves. Roof of the church tore open on the north side. Chimney at Wendell Hoke's place is blocked with snow. They cannot get a fire going. He sat down near the flames and held his hands over the heat. If this keeps up past 3 days, people will start dying. Linnea set down her knife. Are you here to tell me I should help them? Silas looked at her across the fire. I am here because it is warmer than my cabin, and my cabin lost half its roof an hour ago. He paused. But since you asked, yes, you should think about it. They laughed at me, Silas. Every single one of them. Thaddeus cut off my supplies. Maricela told me I was a child. Rourke said I had gone wild. My own stepmother stood in the store and told people I was unstable. I know. Then you know I do not owe them anything. You do not. Then why should I open this door? Silas was quiet for a while. The fire cracked between them. Sparks rose toward the natural chimney in the ceiling. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before. Slower. 21 years ago, he said, I sat exactly where you are sitting. Same cave, same kind of storm, though not as bad. I had enough supplies for myself, enough firewood, enough food, and I knew there were people in the valley who were cold and hungry and scared. He paused. I chose not to open the door. I stayed inside and waited for winter to pass. And it did pass. But 3 people died that I might have been able to save. For 21 years I have lived with that. He looked at her. Surviving alone is just a slower way of disappearing. Linnea did not answer. She stared at the fire and felt the weight of every supply she had hauled up that hillside. Every blister, every bruised shoulder. Every morning she had woken in the dark and chosen to keep going when no one in the world expected her to. All of it built for one person. All of it hers. If I open this door, she said, and let them in, my supplies will not last the winter. I planned for 1, maybe 2, not a dozen. I know, so I would be giving up my own survival for people who threw me away. Silas leaned back against the stone wall. Or you would be becoming the kind of person who does not throw people away, even when she has every reason to. The silence after that was long enough for the fire to burn down to coals before either of them spoke again. Then Linnea said very quietly, if I let them die when I could have helped, I would become Della, just someone deciding who is worth saving and who is not. Silas nodded once. He did not say I told you so. He did not need to. Morning came gray and howling. Linnea crawled to the entrance and pushed through the wall of accumulated snow to look outside. The valley had vanished. Where roads had been there were now smooth white plains shaped by wind into drifts taller than a man. Fence posts had disappeared entirely. Rooftops showed as dark patches beneath growing mounds of snow, and from some chimneys no smoke rose at all. The storm was not weakening. If anything, the wind had gained force overnight, driving snow and curtains across the landscape with a sound that reminded Linnea of fabric tearing, slow and deliberate and final. She retreated inside, brushing ice from her face, and sat near the fire to warm her hands. Then she saw something through the entrance gap. Movement on the slope below, barely visible through the blowing snow. A figure struggling uphill through waist-deep drifts, falling every few steps, getting up slower each time, too small and too unsteady to be a man. The figure fell again, and this time did not rise immediately. Linnea was moving before she had time to think about it. She grabbed her lantern, pulled her coat tight, and pushed out through the entrance into the full force of the blizzard. The cold hit her face so hard her eyes watered shut instantly. Snow drove against her from the left, packing into the folds of her clothing. She could barely see 10 feet ahead. She fought downhill through drifts that grabbed at her legs, half running and half falling. Following the direction she had seen the figure collapse, she found Granny Maeve Tolliver face down in the snow. The old woman's gloves were crusted with ice so thick they looked like white stones. One side of her coat had frozen stiff. Her lips were gray. Her eyes were closed. Maeve, Linnea said, dropping to her knees. Maeve, can you hear me? The old woman's eyes opened. Barely. They were unfocused, drifting. The eyes of someone whose body had already begun shutting down. But her lips moved. I knew, she whispered. I knew you had gone underground. Linnea pulled her arm over her shoulder and lifted. The old woman weighed almost nothing, which made it worse somehow. The lightness of a body that had already given so much to cold and age and hard years that there was barely anything left to save. You are coming with me, Linnea said. Getting back to the cave nearly killed them both. The uphill climb through deepening snow, with a half-conscious woman draped across her shoulders, was the hardest physical thing Linnea Mercer had ever done. Twice the wind struck them broadside and knocked Granny Maeve sideways, tearing her from Linnea's grip. Twice Linnea went back, lifted her again, kept climbing. Her legs burned. Her lungs screamed. She could not feel her hands. The third time Granny Maeve slipped, Linnea caught her by the collar and held on with a grip that came from somewhere deeper than muscle. Somewhere in the part of her that had decided 3 months ago on a frozen hillside that she would not let winter take anything else from her. She could see the cave entrance only because she had memorized its location relative to a split boulder 20 yards below, and even that landmark was disappearing under snow. Then they crossed the threshold. The narrow stone passage swallowed the wind. The roar dropped to a murmur, then to silence. Warmth reached them like a hand. Silas was already on his feet. He took Granny Maeve from Linnea's arms and carried her to the fire as if she weighed no more than a child. He removed her frozen gloves and began rubbing her hands between his own, working the blood back into fingers that had gone white at the tips. Linnea wrapped a blanket around the old woman's shoulders and fed the fire until it blazed. Granny Maeve's eyes focused gradually. She looked around the cave, took in the shelves, the stacked wood, the organized rows of provisions, the platform bed raised off the floor. Her expression moved from confusion to recognition to something close to awe. You really prepared for this, she whispered. Someone had to, Linnea said. I want to stop here for just a moment, dear listener. I want you to imagine that cave. Imagine the firelight on the rock walls. Imagine 3 people. A 16-year-old girl who had been told she did not matter. A 61-year-old man who had carried a question for 21 years. A 70-year-old midwife who had been 10 years old in 1823 when she watched her father die in the cold. 3 people who by all rights should not have been together. And yet there they were, warm, alive, listening to a storm try to tear the world apart outside. If you are listening from a kitchen somewhere right now, somewhere warm with snow falling outside your own window, I want you to take a deep breath. Look around the room you are in and ask yourself who is in your cave. Who would you carry through a storm? Who would you let through your door even after they had laughed at you? Write me back in the comments. I want to know. Now let us go back, because the storm was not done, and the second arrival was coming up the hill. They were trapped inside for 2 full days after that. The blizzard screamed outside without pause, building drifts against the hillside, erasing every trace of the world below. Inside the cave, the 3 of them settled into a rhythm. Linnea managed the fire. Silas melted snow in buckets for drinking water. Granny Maeve, once her strength returned, sorted the food stores and calculated rations with the sharp efficiency of a woman who had survived famine before. They did not talk much. There was a comfort in the silence. The particular quiet of 3 people who had each in their own way learned that words are often less honest than actions. Silas whittled a spoon from a piece of pine and gave it to Granny Maeve for her soup. Granny Maeve mended a tear in Linnea's blanket with a needle she kept in her coat pocket. Linnea divided every meal into 3 exactly equal portions, without being asked, and without comment. These small gestures said more than conversation could have. One evening, while Linnea stirred a pot of potato soup over the coals, Granny Maeve looked around the chamber slowly. The firelight moved across her face, softening the deep lines, and for a moment she looked much younger. "You know what this place reminds me of?" she asked. "What?" "Common sense." Linnea laughed quietly, briefly, but genuinely. The first time she had laughed in weeks. Silas watched from his corner and said nothing, but the corners of his mouth shifted slightly. On the third morning, the storm weakened enough to see outside. The sight stunned all three of them. Snowdrifts reached rooftops. The road through town had ceased to exist. Several barns on the east side of the valley had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. Smoke rose weakly from only a handful of chimneys. Granny Maeve stared toward town. "They are in trouble," she said. Linnea already knew. She had known since the first morning when she had counted the smokeless chimneys. By afternoon, the first survivors appeared. Wendell Hoke came struggling through the snow, carrying his son Ansel on his back. The boy's lips were blue. His eyes were half closed. Wendell himself looked like a man who had been fighting for his life for 3 days and losing. His coat was torn at the shoulder. His boots were soaked through. When Linnea pushed open the cave entrance and he saw the warm glow behind her, he stopped in the snow and stared. "You have been living here," he said. "Yes." He looked past her into the lit chamber, at the shelves, the fire, the organized supplies, and his face did something complicated. Shame and relief and exhaustion all at once. Linnea saw him glance at the shelf where she kept the dried corn, and she knew he recognized it, the same kind he had been leaving at the trail marker every Thursday. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them mentioned it. "Some things are better left where they are." "Please," he said quietly. "Our stove went out 2 days ago. The chimney is completely blocked. I could not clear it." Linnea stepped aside. "Come in." She wrapped Ansel in a blanket near the fire and gave him warm water first, then soup. The boy shivered violently for 20 minutes before the warmth began to reach him. Then he curled against a sack of grain and fell asleep with the sudden completeness of a child whose body has finally decided it is safe. Wendell sat beside his son and held his hand and did not speak. He did not need to. The gratitude was in his grip. That evening, while Ansel slept, Wendell finally spoke to Linnea for the first time since his arrival. "I sat in that diner," he said, staring at the fire, "when you came in and warned us. I sat right there and I did not say a word. I knew you were right. I had been watching the sky for weeks. I knew it was coming, and I still did not back you up. Why not?" Wendell was quiet for a long time, because backing you up would have meant disagreeing with Thaddeus. And disagreeing with Thaddeus means your credit at the store gets harder. Your orders take longer. Your prices go up just enough that you notice but cannot prove anything. He looked at his hands. "I chose my credit line over your dignity." "That is the truth of it. You left corn at the trail marker every Thursday," Linnea said. Wendell looked at her sharply. "You knew that was me." "I knew. That does not make up for the diner." "No," Linnea agreed, "but it kept me fed during the weeks Thaddeus's band spread to the farming families. So it made a difference. Not the same kind of difference, but a real one." Wendell nodded slowly. He did not say anything more that night. But from that point forward, whenever Linnea made a decision about the cave, whether it was rationing or fire management or sleeping arrangements, Wendell backed her without hesitation. Not because he owed her, because he had seen what silence cost. And he had decided he was done paying that price. The fourth day brought more. A woman and 2 children from the east side of the valley. A young couple from one of the farming homesteads, half frozen, carrying nothing but each other. By noon, the cave held 9 people. By evening, the number had risen to 11. Rourke Donnelly arrived just before dark on the 4th day. Frost coated his beard so thickly it looked like a white mask. He came through the cave entrance and stopped dead, staring at the interior, the way a man stares at something he has fundamentally misunderstood. The shelves stretched along the walls, stacked with jars and grain sacks and potatoes. Firewood sat dry and ready. The cave air was warm and steady while the storm continued to scream outside. "You built all this yourself?" he asked. "Yes." "I laughed at you for hauling supplies up this hill." "You did." Rourke removed his gloves slowly, looking around the chamber with an expression Linnea recognized as the particular discomfort of a man realizing he has been wrong about something important. "Yeah," he said. Then after a pause that seemed to cost him something, "Guess I was the fool." He was not alone. Rourke had brought his 6-year-old sister, Renly. The child was burning with fever, coughing so deeply that each breath sounded like something tearing inside her chest. Her small body radiated heat that Linnea could feel through the blanket when she took the girl from Rourke's arms. Linnea looked at the flushed face, and then at her food supplies, and did the count automatically. Each person who entered this cave shortened the timeline, but she did not hesitate. "Put her near the fire. Warm water first. Small sips." Granny Maeve examined Renly with the practiced hands of a woman who had nursed the sick when no doctor existed within 50 miles. She pulled Linnea aside and spoke quietly. "Lung fever, or close to it. She needs warmth and water and rest. If the fever does not break in 2 days," she left the sentence unfinished. Rourke heard. He sat down beside Renly and took her hand, and his face went white. The big-voiced blacksmith who had called Linnea wild sat in the firelight, holding his little sister's fingers and looking like a man who had discovered that all his certainty about the world amounted to nothing. His hands, which could bend iron, trembled visibly as he stroked the girl's hair. By the 5th day, nearly a dozen people sheltered inside the cave. Families shared blankets near the fire. Children slept against sacks of grain. Snowmelt simmered in a kettle suspended over coals. Maricela Whitcomb had arrived on the 4th day, wet and shaking, and had not said a word about children or experience or knowing better. She simply sat where Linnea told her to sit, and accepted the food Linnea gave her, and watched the 16-year-old girl manage a cave full of frightened adults with the quiet competence of someone who had been preparing for this moment without knowing it. Then Caleb Pruitt arrived with his son. Caleb was 42, a broad-chested farmer with hands like shovels and a voice that filled rooms whether the rooms wanted filling or not. His son Cassius was 16, thin and watchful. He followed his father carrying a bundle of wet blankets. Caleb immediately began complaining about the cold, the cramped space, the lack of proper food. He paced the cave like a penned animal, muttering about his farm and his livestock and the unfairness of being reduced to sleeping in a hole in the ground. That night, when Linnea divided the evening rations into equal portions, Caleb stood up. "I am twice the size of half the people in here," he said, pointing at his portion. "I need more than that." "Equal portions," Linnea said, "no exceptions." "Who gave you the right to make rules? This is not your house. It is a hole in the ground." Rourke stepped forward, positioning himself between Caleb and Linnea. "She built this place," he said. "She stocked it. She is the reason any of us are alive right now. You want to argue about portions? You can argue outside." Silas spoke from the shadows near the back wall, his voice low and even. "I have seen men kill each other over half a loaf of bread in winter. Equal shares is the only way nobody dies by another person's hand." The cave went silent. Firelight moved across the faces of a dozen people, casting long shadows up the stone walls and making everyone look older and more fragile than they were. Caleb looked around for someone who would back him. No one met his eyes. Then his own son spoke. Father Cassius said, "Stop." His voice was quiet, but firm. "She is right." Caleb looked at his son as if he had been struck. Cassius did not look away. For a long moment the two of them stood there, father and son, and something shifted between them. That had nothing to do with food portions and everything to do with what a boy sees when he watches his father choose selfishness in front of strangers. It was the kind of moment that cannot be undone. Cassius would remember this for the rest of his life, and so would Caleb, and both of them knew it. Caleb sat down. He took his portion without another word, but his eyes stayed angry. Later, when the others were asleep, Cassius came to where Linnea was banking the fire for the night. "I am sorry about my father," he said. "You do not need to apologize for someone else. I know, but someone needed to say it." He went back to his blanket and lay down, and Linnea watched him for a moment. This boy who was almost her age, and who had just chosen honesty over loyalty in front of a cave full of witnesses. She understood the cost of that choice, because she had made a version of it herself the night she walked out of her father's house and chose survival over belonging. On the sixth night, there was a sound at the entrance, soft, barely audible above the wind. Linnea crawled to the passage and pushed Snow aside and found Verity Crail crouched in the gap, shaking violently, her hair matted with ice, a small sack clutched against her chest. Verity. Linnea pulled her inside. Verity's teeth were chattering too hard for her to speak clearly. Linnea brought her to the fire and wrapped a blanket around her and waited until the shaking slowed enough for words. I took food from the storeroom, Verity finally said. She opened the sack. Flour, dried corn, a handful of salted pork. Not much, but something. Father saw me take it. He said if I walked out that door, I was not his daughter anymore. Linnea looked at the girl she had known since childhood. So why did you come? Verity's eyes filled. Because he is keeping the storeroom locked. He has 200 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of salt pork, 40 jars of preserves, and he is only giving supplies to the families he chooses. The families who owe him money. Everyone else gets nothing. She wiped her face with the back of her shaking hand. But Linnea, there is something else. What? Verity looked at the fire for a long moment before she could continue. Della is at our house. Linnea did not understand at first. What do you mean? I mean she has been with us since the storm started. She came to our house the day before the blizzard hit, with her trunk and her dresses and the baby in her belly. She has been sleeping in the spare room. She and my father have been eating from the storeroom, just the two of them, while the rest of the town freezes. The cave was very quiet. Linnea felt the fire warmth on her face, and the cold inside her chest, and the slow, heavy weight of understanding. Della had not just sold the house. Della had moved into the safest building in Copper Hollow, with the man who had cut off Linnea's supplies, the man who had laughed at her warning in the diner. She knew, Linnea said. Della knew the storm was coming. That is why she sold the house when she did. Verity nodded. She has known for weeks. They both have. That night, Renly's fever reached its peak. The child burned so hot that the blanket over her was damp with sweat. Her small body jerked with coughs that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than her lungs. Granny Maeve stayed beside her through every hour, changing wet cloths on her forehead, spooning warm water with honey into her mouth, whispering words that might have been prayers or might have been instructions or might have been both. Silas had brought a small jar of honey from his cabin before the roof collapsed. Rourke sat next to his sister and held her hand so tightly his knuckles were white. He did not speak. He did not move. He did not eat when Linnea brought him food. The man who had opinions about everything sat in absolute silence and watched his sister fight for her life and discovered that all his words were worth nothing. At some point past midnight, Renly stopped coughing. The cave went very quiet. Rourke's hand tightened on his sister's fingers, and his breathing stopped, and Linnea felt the entire cave hold its breath. Then Renly drew a long, clear breath, deeper than any she had taken in days, and her face relaxed, and the sweat on her forehead began to cool. Near dawn on the seventh day, the fever broke completely. Renly opened her eyes, blinking at the firelight, and said in a small, clear voice, "Rourke, where are we?" Rourke gathered her into his arms. His shoulders shook. No sound came out. Granny Maeve caught Linnea's eye across the fire and nodded once. Linnea exhaled a breath she had not realized she had been holding for 2 days. Afterward, Maricela Whitcomb sat beside Linnea while the others rested. The minister's wife was quiet for a time, studying her own hands, turning them over as if looking for something written on her palms. Then she said, "I owe you an apology. At the diner, I said the men here had lived through more winters than you. I was wrong about what that meant." Linnea looked at her. "You were not completely wrong. I am young. I just happened to be the only young person who prepared." Maricela smiled, a tired, honest expression that held no pretense. "I am the minister's wife," she said. "I should have been the one to open my door that first night. Not for one night, for however long you needed. You gave me a night on your bench. That was more than most people offered. It was not enough." No, Linnea agreed. It was not. Maricela reached over and took Linnea's hand. Her grip was stronger than Linnea expected. "My husband will be ashamed when he hears about all of this. Do not tell him. No, I will tell him. He needs to hear it. This whole town needs to hear what it looks like when the person you failed is the same person who saves you. On the seventh evening, Linnea counted the remaining supplies while the others slept. She moved along the shelves with her lantern held low, touching each sack, each jar, each bundle. The way a person counts money she knows is almost gone. Flour. Less than 15 pounds remaining. Potatoes. Maybe 20. Some softening at the eyes. Salted pork. 3 pieces. Enough for one more pot of soup if she stretched it with snow water. And the last of the dried corn. The preserves were gone. Entirely eaten on the 4th day when 2 small children had arrived crying. And she had nothing else sweet enough to stop their tears. She thought about what Della would say if she could see her now. Della would say, "The numbers do not lie." And Della would be right about the numbers. But Linnea had learned something this winter that Della Mercer would never understand. There are things that matter more than numbers. The sound of Renly breathing clearly after 3 days of fever. The look on Wendell's face when Ansel fell asleep, safe and warm. The weight of Granny Maeve's hand on her shoulder in the dark. Those things do not fit into columns. They do not subtract. The numbers were still grim. At the current rate, they had enough food for 2 more days, if she cut the portions by a third. Water was not a problem. They had endless snow to melt. Firewood would last perhaps 4 days. But food was the wall they were heading toward, and she could see it clearly now. She told only Silas. He looked at her and said what she already knew. If the storm does not stop by day 9, we go outside regardless. Some chance is better than none. That night, with the others asleep and the fire burned low, Linnea sat near the entrance and stared into the dark. The wind had shifted, coming now from the northwest, and it carried a sound she could not identify. A deep, intermittent groaning from somewhere far away, as though the mountains themselves were tired of holding so much weight. Verity came and sat beside her. Neither spoke for a while. Then Verity asked, "Are you afraid?" "Yes." "Of what?" "The storm." Linnea shook her head slowly. "I am afraid that when this is over, everything will go back to the way it was. They will thank me. Maybe. Then they will forget. Then I will be the girl who got thrown out again. The surplus." "That will not happen," Verity said. "There are some things people cannot forget. This is one of them." Verity went back inside to sleep. Linnea stayed. After a few minutes, Silas came and sat where Verity had been. He did not look at Linnea. He looked out at the storm, at the darkness and the driving snow. And when he spoke, his voice was different than she had heard before. Softer, older somehow, as though the words had been waiting a very long time to be said. "You are wrong about one thing," he said. "You said you are afraid of being forgotten, but you are also afraid of being remembered. Because being remembered means you belong here. It means this place and these people are part of you, and you have not been ready to belong anywhere since your father died." Linnea did not answer. She could not answer. Because Silas Wren, the man who had lived alone so long he had started talking to stone, had just named the wound she had been carrying beneath every other wound, the fear beneath her anger, beneath her independence, beneath her preparation. Not the fear of winter, not the fear of dying, the fear that opening herself to a place and a people meant giving them the power to break her. The way the mine had broken her father, the way the kitchen table had broken her future. Belonging was the most dangerous thing she could do, more dangerous than blizzards, more dangerous than starvation, because you can prepare for cold, but you cannot prepare for the moment someone you love decides you are not enough. Tears ran down her face and froze on her cheeks before they reached her jaw. Silas did not comfort her. He simply sat beside her in the cold, dark entrance of a cave on a hillside above a dying valley. 2 people who understood loneliness and waited for either the storm to break or the morning to come, whichever arrived first. The storm broke on the 8th morning, not all at once. There was no dramatic clearing of the sky, no sudden silence. Instead, the wind simply grew tired. It lost its edge hour by hour through the night, dropping from a sustained howl to a low moan to something almost like breathing. And by the time the first gray light appeared at the cave entrance, the world outside had gone still for the first time in 8 days. Linnea was already awake. She had not slept more than an hour at a time during the final night, watching the fire, counting the remaining food, listening for changes in the wind. When the silence came, it was so complete that she could hear the heartbeat in her own ears. She crawled to the entrance and pushed aside the packed snow and looked out. The valley had been remade. Every familiar shape was gone, buried or altered beyond recognition. Where the road through Copper Hollow had been, there was now a smooth white plain, broken only by the dark angles of rooftops emerging from snow, like the spines of something vast and sleeping. Fence lines had vanished completely. The church steeple, missing its north section of roof, stood crooked against a sky the color of cold iron. Several barns on the eastern edge of the valley had collapsed entirely, their timbers fanned outward beneath the weight, and from some chimneys no smoke rose at all. Linnea stood at the cave entrance and breathed air so cold and clean it hurt her lungs. Behind her she heard movement, people waking, blankets shifting. Then a small voice. Ansel Hoke, 7 days deep in a cave and desperate for the outside. Can we go out? Wendell put his hand on his son's shoulder. In a minute. But Ansel had already squeezed past Linnea and stumbled out into the snow. He sank to his waist immediately, then pushed forward 2 more steps, looked up at the white sky, and laughed. The sound carried across the silent valley with startling clarity, a child's laughter echoing off the snowfields and the buried rooftops in the still air. It was the first laughter any of them had heard in 8 days, and it did something to every adult standing in that cave entrance. Rourke closed his eyes. Maricela put her hand over her mouth. Granny Maeve stood very still and let the sound wash over her. Even Caleb Pruitt, who had spoken to almost no one since the night his son corrected him, lifted his head and looked toward the boy with an expression that was not quite softness, but was no longer hard. Rourke carried Renly out into the light. The girl squinted against the brightness. Her fever gone for 3 days now, her color returning. She pointed at the snowfield and said something to her brother that no one else could hear, and Rourke nodded and held her tighter. Silas Wren stood at the back of the group, apart from the others, watching the valley below. His face gave away nothing. Linnea looked at him, and he looked back, and neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say between them that had not already been said in the dark. Cassius Pruitt stood beside Linnea without being asked. When his father Caleb pushed past them both and started down the slope without a word, Cassius did not follow. He stayed where he was. Standing next to the girl his father had tried to bully over a plate of food, and watched Caleb's broad back descend through the snow toward town. It was a small act, staying. But small acts are sometimes the loudest declarations a person can make. The walk down took nearly an hour. The snow was chest-deep in the drifts, and even in the shallows it reached past their knees. They moved in a single file line, Linnea and Rourke breaking trail at the front, the others following in their tracks. Silas brought up the rear, silent and watchful. Granny Maeve walked slowly but without complaint, one hand on Wendell's arm for balance. Ansel walked on his own, stomping through the snow with the determined energy of a boy who had spent a week underground and intended to make up for every minute of it. They reached the main road, or where the main road had been, by mid-morning. Copper Hollow looked like a town that had been struck by a fist, and then buried. Windows were smashed in 3 houses. The feedlot's roof had caved in. A wagon was overturned against the side of the blacksmith shop, thrown there by wind. People were already out digging, their movements slow and stunned, the mechanical labor of survivors who had not yet understood the full scope of what they survived. 2 families on the south end of town had been trapped inside their homes for 6 days, unable to open their doors against the packed snow. Neighbors were digging them out when Linnea's group arrived. The families emerged blinking and crying, their children shivering, their stoves cold for 4 days. They had burned their kitchen chairs on the 3rd night. The mother held her youngest child against her chest and would not put him down, not even when they offered her hot water, as if letting go of him for 1 second would allow the storm to take him back. But it was the general store that drew everyone's attention. Thaddeus Crail's building stood largely intact. Its walls were reinforced with extra timber. Its roof had held. Its windows were shuttered and sealed. While every other structure in Copper Hollow had suffered damage or partial collapse, the general store looked as though it had been built for this specific storm, because it had. Thaddeus had spent the weeks before the blizzard fortifying his own building, reinforcing his own walls, protecting his own inventory. While the rest of the town prepared normally, Thaddeus Crale had prepared exclusively for himself. Rourke Donnelly walked toward the store with a look on his face that Linnea had not seen before. Not anger exactly, something colder and more deliberate. He stopped in the trampled snow in front of the store's door, which was barred from inside, and he called out, "Thaddeus, open the door." Nothing. Linnea and the others gathered behind Rourke in the churned snow. More townspeople arrived, drawn by the confrontation, coming from all directions through the drifts. Within 10 minutes, nearly half the town stood in front of Thaddeus Crale's store in the cold morning air. Thaddeus Rourke called again. His voice was louder now. "Open the door, or I will open it myself." The bar lifted. The door swung inward. Thaddeus Crale stood in the doorway, thinner than Linnea remembered, his face drawn, his pale eyes moving across the crowd and calculating. He looked like a man who had been expecting this moment and dreading it in equal measure. But standing behind him, half hidden in the shadow of the doorway, was Della Mercer. The crowd saw her at the same moment Linnea did. Della was wearing a clean wool dress. Her hair was combed. Her cheeks were rosy with warmth. Her hands rested on the obvious curve of her belly. She looked in every way like a woman who had spent the storm exactly where she wanted to be, in a warm building with plenty of food, while the rest of the town froze. I want you to pause here with me for a moment, dear listener, because I want you to feel what that crowd felt. I want you to imagine standing in the snow, cold, exhausted, hungry, your house damaged, your children sick, your livestock dead in the snow, and looking into the warmest building in town and seeing the two people who had let it happen, standing side by side, well-fed, untouched, if you have ever stood in a crowd like that, watching the truth of something finally become visible. You know exactly the silence I am describing. It was the silence of a town waking up. "You locked this store," Rourke said quietly, "during the worst storm in the history of this valley. You sat in here with 200 pounds of flour and 100 pounds of salt pork and God knows what else, while Renly nearly died of lung fever in a cave." "I protected my inventory," Thaddeus said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "I have a right to protect what is mine." "A right," Rourke repeated. The word came out of him like something rotten. "Renly is 6 years old. I offered supplies to families who came to me. Several families received provisions. The families you chose," Wendell Hoke said. Quiet Wendell, who never raised his voice, who never argued, who had sat silent in the diner the day Linnea tried to warn the town. He pushed forward now, until he stood in the open space between the crowd and the store door. His son Ansel stood behind him watching, and Linnea realized with a start that this was the first time she had ever seen Wendell Hoke angry. It transformed him. The gentle widower with the kind eyes and the calloused hands became something harder, something forged. And when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that had nothing to do with volume, and everything to do with conviction. "You chose who got food based on who owed you favors. The families who were already in debt to this store. Everyone else, including my boy Ansel, got nothing." Thaddeus opened his mouth. Wendell continued. "My son's lips were blue when I carried him up that hillside to Linnea's cave. He was 8 years old and turning blue, and I had nothing to give him. Nothing, because you locked this door." The crowd shifted. Linnea watched faces change. People who had lived alongside Thaddeus for years, who had bought from his store and owed him credit and tolerated his position on the council, looked at him now with an expression that went beyond anger. It was recognition. The recognition of a thing they had always known but chosen not to see. Linnea stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. In the silence of that crowd, she did not need to. "You refused to sell to me 3 months ago," she said. "You told me I was hoarding in a way that harmed the community. Then you locked your store during a blizzard and distributed supplies only to people who served your interest." She paused. "So which one of us was harming the community, Mr. Crale?" The silence that followed was absolute. And then Della spoke. She stepped forward out of the doorway, into the cold morning light. She looked at the crowd, then at Linnea. And the calm, careful mask she had worn for 3 months began very slowly to slip. I did not throw her out because there was not enough food, Della said. A murmur moved through the crowd. Della closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked older than 38, much older. I threw her out because I needed her father to die without an heir in the house, so I could sell the house to Thaddeus for $200 and use that money to leave Copper Hollow before the baby came. Linnea's mouth went dry. I had a plan, Della said, to start over somewhere. In Denver, maybe, or Cheyenne, someplace where no one knew me, someplace where I could raise this child without anyone asking where its father was. She looked down at her belly, but none of that excuses what I did. She lifted her eyes again. To Linnea. I did not throw you out because the numbers did not balance, Linnea. I threw you out because I looked at you, 16 years old, standing in our kitchen, with nowhere to go. And I saw myself. The crowd was completely silent. I was 14 years old, Della said, when my own stepmother put me out of my father's house in St. Louis. My father had just died. The house belonged to her, and she did not want me there. I had no one. I had nothing. I spent 3 years working in a laundry, 12 hours a day, sleeping in a back room with 3 other girls. I almost did not survive it. And when I finally clawed my way out and married a man with money, I told myself I would never be that powerless again. I would never be hungry again. I would never be cold again. I would never be without a roof again. She looked at Linnea, and then your father got sick, and I was pregnant, and the money was running out, and I looked at you, and I saw myself at 14, standing in another woman's kitchen with no power, and I made a choice. I chose to be the stepmother this time, instead of the girl. I chose to do to you what was done to me, because I could not bear to be on that other side of the table ever again. Her voice broke. I am not asking for forgiveness, Linnea. I am not asking for anything. I am just telling you. Because you deserve to know that the cruelty done to you was not arithmetic, and it was not strategy. It was a wound, wearing my face. Della stopped talking. She put one hand on the doorframe to steady herself, and the cold morning held its breath. I want to stop here, dear listener, just for a moment, because what Della Mercer said is one of the hardest truths a story like this can tell. The people who hurt us are sometimes carrying their own wounds. That does not excuse them. It does not undo what they did. It does not mean Linnea owes Della anything. It does not mean you owe anyone anything. But it does mean that the chain of cruelty can sometimes be traced back further than we know. And sometimes, just sometimes, naming the chain is the first step in breaking it. I am going to ask you something gentle. Take a breath and ask yourself if there is someone in your life whose cruelty was inherited, whose wound passed through them onto you, and whether you might be ready, not to forgive them, not yet, but to set down the weight of pretending you do not understand them. Now let us see what Linnea does, because she still had a choice to make. Linnea looked at her stepmother for a long time. She did not feel forgiveness. Not yet. That was not how the world worked. That was not how the heart worked. Forgiveness was a long road, and she was only standing at the beginning of it. But she felt something else. She felt recognition. The same recognition the crowd had felt looking at Thaddeus. The recognition of a truth that had always been there, hidden beneath a story. Della had not been a monster. She had been a child once. A child like Linnea, standing on a porch in St. Louis with nowhere to go. And she had decided somewhere in those 3 years of laundry steam and cold beds that she would never be that child again. The cost of her promise had been Linnea. I cannot promise you anything, Linnea finally said. Her voice was quiet, but steady. I cannot promise you forgiveness. I cannot promise you a place in my life. She looked down at Della's belly. But the baby in there is my sister. She paused, and she did not choose any of this. Della began to cry, quietly, without sound, just the slow tracks of water down her cheeks. Wendell Hoke turned to the crowd then. His voice carried, I am calling for the council to remove Thaddeus Crail from his position overseeing winter supply distribution. Effective immediately. All in favor, raise your hand. Maricela Whitcomb's hand went up first, then Rourke's. Then one by one hands rose across the crowd. The families who had been refused, The neighbors who had dug each other out. Wendell, Granny Maeve, Verity. And finally standing at the back of the crowd with his jaw set and his eyes on the ground, Caleb Pruitt raised his hand. Cassius, standing beside Linnea, raised his hand too. And father and son both saw each other in that moment, arms raised for the same cause. And something passed between them. That was not forgiveness, but might have been its beginning. Every hand was a nail. Linnea watched Thaddeus count them with those calculating eyes, and understood that she was witnessing the end of something more than a man's position on a council. She was watching a man discover that the power he had built by controlling what people needed could be destroyed in a single morning by those same people deciding they no longer needed him to survive. Thaddeus looked across the crowd one final time, and his gaze found Verity. His daughter stood near Linnea, not behind her, beside her, looking back at her father with an expression that contained grief and resolve in equal measure. Thaddeus stared at his daughter for a long moment. Then he stepped backward into the store and closed the door. Not with a slam, just a quiet click. The sound of a man retreating into the only space still his. Rourke and Wendell opened the store. The door was no longer barred. They distributed supplies to every family in the valley equally, without preference. Linnea organized the distribution the way she had organized the cave, measuring portions, tracking inventory, ensuring that no family received more or less than any other. The skill she had developed keeping a dozen people alive underground translated seamlessly to keeping a town alive above ground. And standing beside her, helping count sacks and weigh flour, was Verity Crail, working in her father's store for the first time, not as his daughter, but as someone else entirely. Over the following week, the work of recovery consumed Copper Hollow. Men dug paths between houses, cleared chimneys, repaired roofs. Women redistributed blankets and clothing. The church, its north wall exposed to the elements, was temporarily sealed with canvas and timber. Talk in the diner returned to practical matters: wood supplies, feed for surviving livestock, how to get a message to Cheyenne requesting assistance. But conversation kept circling back to the same subject: the cave, the supplies, that girl who knew winter was coming. Even people who had once laughed at Linnea's preparation spoke differently now, not just with respect, with the particular discomfort of people who understood that their survival had depended on someone they had dismissed, and that this fact could not be undone or explained away. Silas Wren disappeared on the second day after the storm. Linnea woke to find his corner of the cave empty. His blanket was folded neatly on the stone floor. The deerskin coat was gone. The only trace he left was the small hatchet with the short handle, the one he had given her weeks before, placed on the shelf near the fire pit, beside a piece of paper torn from something. On it, in handwriting that looked like it had been written by a hand unused to holding a pencil, 5 words: "Cave is yours now. Paid." Linnea read it twice. She folded it and put it in the pocket of her coat, next to the leather pouch containing the lock of her mother's hair. 2 men who had shaped her life, one by dying, one by choosing to let go. She brought the note to Granny Maeve that afternoon. The old woman read it, folded it back along the same creases, and handed it to Linnea. "He did not leave because he did not care," Granny Maeve said. "He left because he was finished. 21 years he carried that question, whether he should have opened the door. You answered it for him, not with words. You answered it by opening the door yourself. Will I see him again?" Granny Maeve smiled, a small and knowing expression. "You will see his boot prints in the snow every winter. That is how he will say hello." It was enough. Some people speak through presence, others through absence. Silas Wren had taught Linnea how to survive a winter, and then he had taught her something harder: how to let someone leave without it meaning they had abandoned you. The difference she understood now was the same as the difference between an open door and a locked one. On a gray afternoon 2 weeks after the storm, Linnea walked down the hill toward the house she had been thrown out of. Snow still covered the porch. The path to the door had been cleared, but not well. A narrow trench through the drift, the work of a woman who had barely enough energy to keep herself warm. She stood at the door for a full minute before she knocked. Della opened it slowly. She looked older than Linnea remembered. The 2 months since they had last spoken had carved new lines around her mouth, and deepened the hollows under her eyes. She had lost weight despite the pregnancy. Her dress hung loose at the shoulders. Behind her, the kitchen was dim. The stove was burning low. The house smelled of boiled turnips and cold wood, and the particular staleness of a place where the windows had not been opened in too long. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Della's eyes moved past Linnea to the sled behind her, where Rourke Donnelly stood beside sacks of flour and potatoes and a small bundle of dried meat. "You came back," Della said. Linnea looked past her into the kitchen. The table was still there. She could see the surface where Della had placed her ledger 3 months ago. The columns of numbers, the crossed-out name. She looked at that table and felt something she did not expect. Not anger, not triumph. A kind of clarity that exists only on the other side of survival. When you have proven something so completely that the need to be acknowledged has burned away. "I did not come back," she said. "I came to see if you needed supplies." Della stood in the doorway. She did not move aside immediately. Linnea could see her processing the situation, the same calculating mind that had reduced her to a line on a ledger, now trying to understand how the girl she had subtracted from her household had returned carrying more provisions than Della had stored for the entire winter. "I sold the house," Della said quietly, "to Thaddeus. But he has been removed from the council, and he is not paying me. I do not know what is going to happen." Linnea looked at her stepmother. "The house belonged to my father," Linnea said. "He left no will that anyone has found. By rights, it is half mine. But I am not here for that either." "Then why?" "Because the baby in your belly is my sister," Linnea said. "And whatever you did to me, she did not do." Della began to cry, not the careful tears of the doorway confession in front of the crowd. Real tears now, the kind a woman cries when she has run out of strategy. "I did not think you would come back," she whispered. "I almost did not." Linnea stepped past her into the kitchen. She set down the sack of flour on the table, over the place where her own name had been crossed out. She set down the potatoes, the dried meat, the small bundle of dried apples Verity had pressed into her hand that morning. "This is for the baby," Linnea said. "Not for you." Della nodded. She did not try to argue. Linnea turned to leave. At the doorway, she stopped. "You said you saw yourself when you looked at me," she said. "I want you to know something. I do not want to be like you. I do not want to look at someone hurting and decide that the way to be safe is to hurt them more. So I am going to do the opposite of what you did, Della. I am going to remember what cruelty felt like. And I am going to use that memory to be kinder. That is not for you. That is for me." She walked out. At the edge of the porch, she turned back once and saw Della standing in the doorway, watching her go. Della's back was straight. Her chin was up. She did not look at the floor. And Linnea felt for the first time in months that she could imagine a future. Not a perfect one, not one with easy reconciliations or tidy endings, but a future, with room in it, for all of them. Verity Crail did not return to her father's house that winter. She stayed in the cave with Linnea until the deepest cold had passed, sleeping on the platform bed, learning to manage the fire, eating meals they cooked together over coals. They did not talk much about Thaddeus. There was no need. But sometimes late at night when the fire was low and the cave was quiet, Verity would stare at the entrance. And Linnea knew she was thinking about her father, alone in his fortified store, surrounded by supplies and silence, and wondering whether loneliness was a punishment, or a choice, or both. Then one morning in late February, Verity told Linnea she was going back. "He is sick," Verity said. She was sitting near the fire, her knees drawn up, staring at the low flames. "No one is checking on him, coughing badly." Linnea did not try to talk her out of it. "Will he let you in? I do not know, but someone has to go." She looked at Linnea with an expression that held no irony in it. Despite the echo, they both recognized the words. Linnea had said them to Granny Maeve the night she dragged her through the blizzard. Someone had to. The same words Linnea had said that night in the snow with Granny Maeve across her shoulders. Some things travel from one person to another. Words, kindnesses, the willingness to climb a hill in the cold. Verity walked down the hill that morning, toward the general store. Linnea watched her go and thought about the strange mathematics of mercy, how it never balanced, how the people who deserved it least often needed it most, how giving it away never subtracted from the person who gave it, but always added something that could not be named or measured. She learned later what happened. Verity knocked on the store's back door. Thaddeus opened it after a long delay, coughing, his face gray with illness, and something else, the particular shade of a man who has been alone with his choices long enough to see their full shape. Verity walked past him without waiting for permission. She put water on the stove. She swept the floor. She made broth from salted pork and fed it to him without conversation. When Thaddeus finally asked, his voice rough and diminished, "Why did you come back?" Verity answered with 4 words, "Because someone had to." She did not explain further. Thaddeus did not ask further. Certain sentences carry enough weight to end a conversation and begin a different one at the same time. Thaddeus Crail never apologized to the town. That was not the kind of man he was. But the store reopened in March, at the old prices, with no restrictions and no favorites. And every week after that, a sack of flour appeared outside the cave entrance, without a name or a note attached. Verity knew it was from her father. She never mentioned it to him. There are conversations that are better conducted through sacks of flour than through words. Della gave birth in the 2nd week of March. Granny Maeve attended the delivery. Linnea sat in the kitchen of her father's old house, while her stepmother labored in the bedroom upstairs. She did not go up, not yet. That bridge would have to be built slowly, one plank at a time. When the baby was born, Granny Maeve came down the stairs carrying a small bundle. A baby girl, pink-cheeked and angry, and very much alive. Della had named her Elise, after Elias. Granny Maeve placed the baby in Linnea's arms. Linnea looked down at her sister. The baby's tiny fingers gripped her own, and something old and tight inside Linnea's chest. Something she had been carrying since the morning she walked out of her father's house with 2 canvas bags. Loosened, just a little. "She is so small," Linnea whispered. "So were you once," Granny Maeve said. Linnea did not visit Della in the 1st week after the birth. She needed time. The hurt was still too fresh. But by the 3rd week, she began to walk down the hill on Sunday afternoons. She would sit in the kitchen for an hour. She would hold the baby. She did not call Della mother. She never would. But she began slowly to call her by her first name, Delphine, the name Della's own mother had given her before everything went wrong. And the first time Linnea said it, Delphine looked at her across the kitchen with an expression that contained no triumph. Only a quiet, grateful exhaustion. The look of a woman who has been given more than she deserves, and who knows it, and who has decided to honor it by not asking for any more. Elise grew. She had Elias Mercer's blue eyes. By the time she was a year old, she would crawl across the kitchen floor toward Linnea every Sunday and lift her arms to be picked up. And Linnea would pick her up and hold her and feel something that was not quite forgiveness, but was its older sister. Some doors take years to open. Linnea had time. Spring came to Copper Hollow the way it always came to the Wyoming high country, slowly and with suspicion, as though the mountains were not entirely convinced that winter had agreed to leave. Snow receded in patches. Creeks began to move beneath their ice. The first green appeared on the south-facing slopes. The town began to rebuild and to change. Root cellars were expanded. 3 new storm shelters were dug into the hillside along the ridge. Families started putting up preserves in September instead of November. Firewood quotas doubled. The council now, without Thaddeus, established a community supply reserve, stored in the church basement, maintained year-round, available to any family regardless of means or standing. Reverend Whitcomb, who had returned from Cheyenne 2 days after the storm ended, and spent his first night back on his knees in the damaged church, personally oversaw the construction of the reserve shelves. His wife Maricela stood beside him and hammered nails and said nothing about the bench or the one night or the girl she had turned away. Linnea did not leave the cave. Granny Maeve invited her to live in the widow's cottage. Wendell offered her a room in his house. Maricela said the parsonage had space. Each offer was genuine. Each was declined. The cave was hers. She had found it with her own stubbornness, built it with her own labor, defended it with her own judgment. It was the first and only thing in her life that belonged to her completely, not granted by a parent, not rented from a landlord, not conditional on someone else's calculations. She had carried potatoes up a frozen hillside when no one believed she would survive. And the cave had answered by keeping her alive. That was a debt that ran in both directions, and Linnea intended to honor it. She turned 17 sometime during the blizzard. She was not sure of the exact date. She had stopped counting days after the fifth person entered the cave, and by the time the storm ended and she thought to check her birthday had passed somewhere in the noise and cold and soup and firelight. Without anyone knowing, including herself, it did not matter. Birthdays are measurements, and Linnea had learned that the most important changes in a life do not happen on schedule. On the first warm day of April, Granny Maeve climbed the hill to the cave, carrying a cloth sack. She moved more slowly than she had in the autumn, and Linnea came down to meet her halfway, taking her arm for the final stretch. They sat together at the cave entrance in watery sunlight, looking down at the valley, where the snow was retreating and the first brown patches of earth were showing through. A hawk circled high above the ridge, the first bird Linnea had seen in months, and they both watched it until it disappeared beyond the tree line. Granny Maeve opened the sack and took out a handful of small paper envelopes, seeds, tomato, bean, squash, and something else Linnea did not recognize. "Where did you get these?" Linnea asked. Granny Maeve smiled. "These," she said, "are not from me." "Not really. These are yours." "What do you mean?" Granny Maeve pressed one of the envelopes into Linnea's hand. The paper was old, faded, but the writing on the front was familiar. Careful schoolteacher script, the kind of handwriting Linnea had not seen in 9 years. Eleanor Mercer, tomato, Brandywine. Linnea's breath caught. "These were my mother's," she whispered. Granny Maeve nodded. "Your mother gave them to me," she said, 3 months before she died. She came to my cottage with this sack. She said she could feel the fever coming. She said she did not have much time, and she gave me these, and she asked me to keep them until you were old enough. "I have been waiting 9 years," Granny Maeve said. "I almost gave them to you last summer, but something told me to wait. I am glad I did." She looked at Linnea. "Your mother knew, even then, that you would need them when the moment was right, that the right moment was not when you were happy. The right moment was when you had survived something and were ready to plant. You survived the winter, Linnea Mercer. Now learn how to grow something in the summer. Survival is not only about enduring, it is about planting." Linnea held the seed packets and felt their weight. Almost nothing, light as breath, and yet containing inside their paper walls the entire possibility of a future. That was not just about staying alive, but about building something that would outlast a single season. She had spent 3 months preparing for destruction. Now someone was asking her to prepare for growth. The difference between the two, she realized, was the difference between a closed fist and an open hand. Both require strength, but only one of them can hold a seed. "Thank you, Maeve," she whispered. The old woman patted her hand. "Thank me in August, when you have got tomatoes." Linnea smiled. A real smile, not the cautious half-expression she had rationed out during the winter months. A full smile that reached her eyes and changed the shape of her face, and for one moment made her look exactly her age, 17 years old, sitting in sunlight with a handful of her dead mother's seeds. And the whole summer ahead. The cave stayed stocked year-round after that. Not hidden anymore. Not secret. People called it Winter Hollow, and the name spread through the valley the way good names do. Naturally, without anyone deciding, it simply became what the place was called, because it described what the place meant: a hollow in the winter, a shelter in the worst of times, built by someone who had been hollowed out herself and chose to fill the space with something other than bitterness. Wendell Hoke began climbing the hill in the late afternoons. He brought timber sometimes to help her expand the shelving. He brought sweet corn from his garden when it came in. He brought his son Ansel some Saturdays. And the boy would sit at the cave entrance and ask Linnea questions about firewood and rope knots and how she had known the storm was coming. Linnea would answer carefully, like a teacher, because she understood that what she had built had become a kind of school, and the lessons in it were going to matter for many years. Wendell did not say much during those visits. He just worked. He had hands that knew how to make things, and eyes that knew how to watch a thing being built. And he watched Linnea the way a man watches a sunrise, as if he understood that the watching was the whole point, and there was no need to interrupt it with talk. One evening in late August, when the tomatoes were red on the vine and the squash was beginning to set fruit, Wendell brought his son up the hill for supper. Linnea cooked a stew with the first of her harvest. They ate sitting on flat stones outside the cave entrance, watching the sun go down behind the Bighorn Mountains. After Ansel had fallen asleep against a sack of grain inside, Wendell sat beside Linnea on the stone. He did not look at her. He looked at the sky. "My wife has been gone 4 years," he said. Linnea did not answer. She understood that he was not making a statement. He was making a confession. Ansel was 4 when she died. He barely remembers her now. "I have spent these 4 years making sure he was warm and fed and safe. And I told myself that was enough, that my life was that, keeping him warm." He paused. "But I sat in that diner the day you came in, and I knew. I knew what was coming, and I let it come, because I had already decided my life was small." Linnea looked at his hands, the calloused hands of a man who had spent his life making things. "What changed?" she asked. "You did," Wendell said. He did not turn his head, but he reached out slowly and placed his hand on the stone between them. Palm up, open, not a demand, not a question, just a hand, resting. Linnea looked at it for a long moment. She did not take it, not yet, but she did not move her own hand away from where it rested, inches from his, and they sat like that. In the last warm light of the August evening, two people who had each lost something, and who had each decided in their own time that loss did not have to be the end of the story. When Wendell finally went home that night, carrying Ansel asleep over his shoulder, Linnea stood at the cave entrance and watched their lantern move down the hillside. And she felt for the first time in a very long time a kind of patience inside her chest. The patience of a woman who knows that some things take a long time to grow, and that the waiting itself is part of the growing. That was enough for now. Some doors opened slowly. On the first morning of true spring, when the snow had pulled back far enough to show the trail clearly, Linnea walked out of the cave at dawn to check her rabbit snares. And she stopped. There, in the thin remaining snow leading up from the tree line and ending 20 yards from the cave entrance, was a line of boot prints. Large boots, long stride. The prints came up the hill, paused, and then turned back toward the forest. Without approaching the entrance, nothing was left beside them. No rabbit, no rope, no hatchet, just the prints themselves, walking toward the cave and then walking away, as if the person who made them had come only to see that the entrance was clear, and the stone above it was solid, and the girl who lived inside was still there. Linnea stood in the early light and looked at those prints for a long time. Then she went back inside, and she added a new mark to the wall beside Silas Wren's old tallies. Not a weak mark, a single vertical line, carved with her folding knife. Beside his hundreds, separated by 21 years and a few inches of stone, it was the only mark she ever made. She did not need to count anymore. Counting is what you do when you are waiting for something to end, and Linnea Mercer was no longer waiting. I want to leave you with one last thought, dear listener. If you have made it all the way to the end of this story with me, I want you to know that I am grateful. I know it was a long one, and I know it had some hard moments inside it, but that is how the best stories are. They walk through the cold places, so that we know we are not alone when we have to walk through cold places of our own. Linnea Mercer's story reminds me that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are carrying wounds we cannot see. That does not excuse them. It does not erase what they did, but it can sometimes set us free, to stop carrying the weight of their cruelty as if it were our fault. I want you to think about that this week. I want you to think about a door you might be ready to open. Not all the way. Maybe just a crack, just enough to let the light back in. And if this story moved you, would you do me one small kindness before you go? Hit the like button. Share it with a friend who might need it. Tell me in the comments what part touched you the most. I read every single comment, and I write each one of these stories with women like you in mind. Women who have lived, who have loved, who have lost, and who are still even now choosing to plant something new. Thank you for listening. I will be here next week with another story. Until then, Be gentle with yourself. The earth remembers, and so do we.